President.
The senator from Ohio.
Mr. President, thank you. And I just listened to my colleague from Michigan talking about the need to reopen government and the need for us to deal with the debt. Of course, I agree with that, as do my colleagues on this side of the aisle. We also heard discussion about the fact that we shouldn't be manufacturing crises. Unfortunately, we have a crisis on our hands, and that is the crisis of debt at record levels. And so I want to talk a little about that today and talk about why this discussion is so important, particularly on extending the debt limit, because that would be the place naturally for us to deal with the problem that faces this generation and certainly future generations, which is this historic level of debt. In a matter of days, we're told that our nation's going to be reaching this debt limit, which is $16.7 trillion. You think about that. That's, I think, $16,000 billion. It's impossible to comprehend that number, but let's try. 16.7 trillion would produce a stack of $1 bills about a million miles high. A million miles high. That's enough, by the way, to go to the moon and back. And it's now bigger, by the way, than the size of our entire economy. Only once in our history we had debt that as a percent of the economy is so large, and that was right after World War II. And frankly, we were able quickly to address that. We didn't have the long-term liabilities we have now, and we had very high defense spending from World War II we were able to reduce. But other than that, we have never been here before, and I would say that we're in uncharted territory. And by the way, it's not just that we have this huge level of debt and deficit and the overhang on the economy, but it's the fact that the economy is also weak. I think they're related. I think this huge level of debt and deficit is like a wet blanket over the economy. Here's an interesting chart. It shows that the debt limit rising twice as fast as the economy has grown in the last 2 years. So the debt increase has gone up by about $2.4 billion. Unfortunately, our GDP increase has been less than half that. So that's the problem that we are trying to face here. It's a lot of back and forth, and I know for some people it looks like this is politics. It's not. It's about a fundamental issue, and there are fundamental disagreements, and I respect those disagreements. But we have to address this problem, and we have to do it in the context of the debt limit, and if we do not, we will simply be kicking the can down the road again and letting down the people we represent. If you divide that debt among the American people, each of us, every man, woman, and child in America, owes around $50,000. And by the way, of course, that's far more than the average annual per capita income for that man, woman, and child in America. So you think about that, it's about $140,000, $150,000 per household on average. That's where we've gotten to. And I don't think it's constructive to be pointing fingers of blame because, frankly, for decades, Republicans and Democrats alike have spent more money than the government takes in. More promises have been made than can be kept. And we have gone through a process of mortgaging the future for our kids and grandkids as a result. But here we are. I would say, in some respects, you could say the greatest single act of bipartisanship here in the United States Congress has been the overspending. So the question is not how we got here, but what are we going to do about it? Where are we going? The President yesterday said that raising the nation's credit limit by another $1 trillion really pays for last year's deficit spending, not next year's. I guess we could have that debate. I would say it's about the future because we're borrowing more money to pay the bills of the country going forward. And that's what many of us want to talk about, is how going forward we can reduce those bills. But the truth is, whether you say you're paying for the past or paying for the future, it really doesn't matter to the American people. And it doesn't matter to our children and grandchildren who end up paying the bill. Because long after we're gone, this huge level of debt and deficit is going to be something that they're going to have to deal with. But we all know the consequences if you don't raise the debt limit. Without a debt limit increase, the federal government's unable to borrow to meet its expenses. And because we're currently borrowing about 20 cents of every dollar the federal government spends, government would be unable to meet all of its obligations. There's been discussion about meeting the interest on the debt. That's only about 8% of revenue coming in. I assume that could be met. But it's true that there are other obligations that frankly can't be met if the government can't borrow, because the government's borrowing more than it's spending more than it takes in and needs to borrow to make up the difference. The deficit, some have said, including some of my colleagues on the other side today, is lower now, and somehow that's an indication that we're okay in terms of the deficit. I would just remind folks that the deficit this year is the 5th largest deficit in the history of our country, in our entire history. It's over $640 billion. And more significantly, the Congressional Budget Office, which is the nonpartisan group around here that analyzes this stuff, says it's temporary, that it's lower than $1 trillion. In other words, within a decade, they say it gets back up to $1 trillion. So, whether it's $640 billion or $1 trillion, it's way too high. Entitlement spending, by the way, will push these annual deficits up to the equivalent of $3.4 trillion a year, 5 times what they are today, within a few decades. That's based on the Congressional Budget Office. At that point, by the way, the national debt would be 2.5 times as large as the entire economy. Again, today it's about the size of the economy. It's a little bigger, but it would be 2.5 times as large as our whole economy. And there's one CBO report I saw recently that simply stops calculating the interest cost at that point because they cannot foresee our economy functioning under those kinds of conditions. And think about your own family budget. Or think about your business. You couldn't function either. The bank wouldn't be able to lend you any money. Both of these outcomes, default today and bankruptcy in the future, are unacceptable. That's why it's time for us to work together to try to do something about them. As the debt ceiling is raised, it's time to address the underlying problem. That's what we're saying. And by the way, the American people are saying that too. Based on the polling I've seen this week, by better than a 2-to-1 margin, the American people are saying don't raise the debt limit without doing something about the spending. And they get it, because for them it is like the credit card. When you reach the limit, you realize you have to do something about the underlying problem, which is how much you're spending. The president says pass the debt limit increase now and we'll address the spending later. I wish it were that simple. But I think he knows, as well as everyone in this chamber and every person who's watching at home today, that Congress simply doesn't reduce spending unless it's forced to do so. And if you don't think that's true, let me remind you of what the history is here. In the past 3 decades, I've gone back and looked at all these deficit reduction plans that did get through Congress. There aren't many, but there are some. Every single instance where there was any significant deficit reduction, it came as a result of what? A discussion about the debt limit. Because that's the time at which there's some pressure here in Congress to actually do something about it. I found one in 2005, a relatively small reduction of spending, but otherwise every single one of them, the Graham-Rudman rescissions back in the 80s, the 1990 Andrews Air Force Base agreement that first President Bush conducted with Democrats, the 1993 balanced budget talks, the 1997 balanced budget agreement that Bill Clinton negotiated with Newt Gingrich, Democrat president, Republican speaker. And of course, the pay-go rules that many Democrats are fond of, those pay-go rules came out of a debt limit discussion. And then finally, we have to look only a couple years ago to the Budget Control Act, where yes, as my colleague has said on the other side of the aisle, there have been some successes in reducing spending. On the discretionary side of the spending, that's about 1/3 of the budget that is appropriated here every year. That came out of the Budget Control Act, which is a result of what? The debt limit. In other words, members listening to the folks back home, and I'm listening to my constituents back home in Ohio right now on this, are saying, don't max out on the credit card again and go over the limit. unless you do something about the problem. So it's little wonder that the American people, by this margin of 2-1 that I talked about, are saying, don't do it without the spending reductions. They know that's the only way that these cuts are likely to happen. Why is it that any increase in the debt limit should also include pro-growth provisions? Well, because one way you get at the debt and deficit, of course, is spending restraint, and we talked about the discretionary spending being about 35% of the budget. We've made progress there. The other 65% of the budget is the mandatory spending side. There we have not made progress. The other part would be revenue, and the first of this year, taxes were raised by $620 billion. What we have not done is deal with the mandatory side. But then finally, of course, economic growth helps. So we should also, as we are extending the debt limit, look at how we can help give the economy a shot in the arm. Tax reform is the way to do that. And there's a consensus here in this body, I think, that we need to do it. That would seem to make sense as well. So we have already made progress on one of the three legs of the stool, which is dealing with the discretionary spending. Pretty much been flat the last couple of years. For the first time, by the way, since the 1950s, actually a reduction in spending for 2 years in a row. But that's only 35% of the budget. The fastest growing part, again, 65% of the budget we have not dealt with. And by the way, that 65% grows to 76% of the budget in the next 10 years, based on the Congressional Budget Office. On the tax side, by the way, the same Congressional Budget Office tells us that starting in 2014, that's next year around the corner, taxes as a percent of our economy will be above its historic level. So in other words, there'll be more taxes coming in from the tax increases in part that were passed earlier this year. But the part that we have not dealt with, again, is mandatory spending. It's the biggest part of our spending. It's the fastest growing part of our spending. And it's politically difficult to deal with. Let's face it. But that's what we're hired to do. That's what we were hired to do. And that's what the president was hired to do in terms of providing leadership. With Obamacare, of course, we've added a new health entitlement program to this part of the budget, the 65%. Already, by the way, these health entitlements were growing more quickly than the rest of the budget, even the rest of mandatory spending. In fact, the Congressional Budget Office tells us that in the next 10 years, the health entitlement programs grow by over 100%. These are vital programs, Medicare and Medicaid, but they've got to be reformed so that they are sustainable into the future, and they're there for our kids and grandkids. With 10,000 baby boomers retiring every day and health care costs continuing to rise, we've got a real problem here. We have to address it. All of us know that. All of us, Democrat, Republican alike, the President, the Congress. And again, history tells us the best way is to link this with the debt limit because that's the opportunity and has traditionally been the opportunity to make progress here. By the way, over the long term, overall revenues projected to increase, discretionary spending is projected to be flat. The entire increase in our deficit, these huge debts and deficits going forward that I talked about, are due to the mandatory spending. Again, that's the Congressional Budget Office, not me. A good place to start, of course, would be some of the mandatory spending reforms the President himself has proposed. That would seem to be less controversial. If they're in the President's budget, that means he supports them. And the President sent a budget up this year, and he included over $700 billion of spending reforms over here on the mandatory side of the budget. This is why what I've been advocating is, let's start there. Let's look at the President's own proposals. These are not the proposals that all Republicans support. But after all, we should have a negotiation. This notion that the President says he refuses to negotiate, that's never been true. Every president has negotiated. And I think the American people are confused by this. How could the President of the United States say, in the context of this debt limit discussion, that he refuses to even talk to the other side? That makes no sense. President Bush, one, rolled up his sleeves. We talked about the 1990 agreements. President Clinton rolled up his sleeves. We talked about it, the 1997 balanced budget agreement he negotiated with then Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. This is what presidents do. We need them to lead, particularly on these tough issues. As we talked about earlier, these are politically tough issues. The president says he doesn't want to be held hostage over the debt limit. He's not. He's been given the opportunity to lead using his own proposals. At least that's my suggestion. We can also take a very simple step as we're going through this to be sure that this newest health care entitlement, which is what the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare is, it's a new entitlement program, doesn't become even more of a deficit driver than many of us on this side fear it will already be. The Affordable Care Act includes a provision that requires that when you get your subsidies under the exchanges, that you have to verify your income. Makes sense. You have to verify your income between 100% of poverty and 400% of poverty. Below that, it would be Medicaid. Above that, it would be the subsidies under the exchanges. Under a final regulation that the administration put out, they said that, well, we know you should verify your income, that's what the law says, but we're going to give all of the exchanges another year to do it, not till 2015. Well, obviously the concern there is that that will be an invitation for fraud and for waste and for big new expenses. As a result, the federal government body in charge of this, the CMS, came out and said, no, we'll do it for federal exchanges. We'll require people to verify their income, but not for state exchanges. Well, there are about 17 states and the District of Columbia that have state exchanges. And they've said to them, you guys can wait. In fact, not just till 2015, but there's no date certain on that. So that certainly should be something that we as United States Congress here should deal with. The Democrats in the chamber here who voted for the Affordable Care Act certainly should support, because the intent of the bill when they signed up for it and when the president supported it was, of course, that you would verify your income. So that's an example of a simple step we could take to prevent the distribution of subsidies until we have a system to verify that those subsidies are going to the right people. Finally, let's give the economy a shot in the arm. And as part of this process, let's do a step forward and say, let's reform the tax code. We're going to differ about the details, but let's get started on it. So my proposal would be, as we have a vote on extending the debt limit, let's do these important reforms we talked about on the mandatory side, but let's also commit to tax reform. Let's force the process. Let's facilitate it. Let's expedite it. Because the American people are not looking just for us to get the spending under control. They want to see this economy growing. Again, they're not happy with this, where the debt's increasing at twice the rate of the economy. What they want to see is opportunities for their kids to get a job. What they want to see is the opportunity to have the dignity and self-respect that comes with a job. And we know that tax reform done properly will be pro-growth. It will create jobs. Again, we're going to differ on some of the details. That's okay. Let's get started on it. Now, perhaps the president doesn't think that spending and the deficits are a real problem. If he thinks that, he should say it. He says just the opposite. He has said he does think that it's necessary for us to address these problems. In fact, again, in his own budget, he has sent proposals forward. So what we need to do is get together and negotiate and talk and deal with this underlying problem. A debt that's nearly $17 trillion is unacceptable to everybody, I hope. And I would think he would welcome the sign that Republicans are giving now that we want to negotiate, we want to talk. Negotiations, by the way, I don't think are a sign of weakness. I don't think coming to the table is a signal of a failure of leadership. I think just the opposite. I think that shows strength and shows leadership. Again, I can promise you Republicans don't support all of President Obama's suggested savings in his budget, and a purely Republican debt limit agreement would look very different from whatever plan might emerge from bipartisan negotiations. But again, the American people sent us here to get stuff done. Using President Obama's own proposals, let's take that first step toward entitlement and pro-growth tax reform and onto some common ground to break the gridlock in D.C. and finally do something positive about that underlying problem that we all acknowledge. Yes, we face serious problems, real challenges, but we also have an opportunity here to do something positive, to deal with the problem we all acknowledge, something that will not only prevent a debt limit crisis today, but a debt crisis tomorrow. Mr. President, I hope we'll move forward in that important project. I think we owe it to the people we represent.